My son-in-law grabbed my wrist and twisted it. Not hard enough to break anything, just hard enough to remind me who he thought was in charge. I didn't say a word. I pulled my arm back, walked to my bedroom, and started packing. The next morning, my daughter threw a brunch for her friends and stood on the back patio with a mimosa raised high, laughing. Finally, this house feels like ours. She had no idea the envelope was already in the mail, and she never saw the man sitting in the car across the street, watching. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. I pulled into the driveway at 7:30, still carrying the smell of sawdust and machine oil from the shop. 41 years in Finnish carpentry leaves marks on you that soap can't fully reach. I'd spent the day at my old colleague Ray's workshop helping him mill crown molding for a restoration project downtown. The kind of detailed work that slows your hands and quiets your mind. I was tired in the good way, the kind of tired that earns sleep. The house was lit up when I came through the side gate, every room blazing. I could hear music from the backyard, something loud with too much bass. My daughter's car sat in the driveway next to her husband's truck, which was parked at an angle, one wheel up on the grass I'd seeded last spring. I went in through the kitchen door, the way I always had. The kitchen smelled wrong. Burned sugar and something chemical underneath it. 3 pots sat unwashed in the sink. A half-empty bottle of wine stood open on the counter next to my wooden cutting board, the one I'd made from a walnut slab 30 years ago, now stained with red rings. I set my keys on the hook by the door and walked through to the living room. My daughter, Cassandra, was curled on the sofa with her phone. Her husband, Derek, sat in my reading chair. Not the couch, not the armchair by the window. My chair, the one I'd had since before Cassandra was born, reupholstered twice, worn soft at the armrests, in the exact shape of my forearms. He was watching something on the television, with the volume up past comfortable. Neither of them looked up when I came in. I walked to the television and turned the volume down 2 notches. Derek looked up then. "What's the issue?" "That's too loud for this time of evening. My neighbor Earl is 78. Derek looked at me the way a man looks at a slow driver in the left lane. Patient on the surface, something hostile underneath. He picked up the remote and turned the volume back up 1 notch. Not quite where it was. Just enough to make a point. Cassandra didn't look up from her phone. I went to my bedroom, washed my hands, changed my shirt, stood at the window for a moment looking out at the backyard, at the garden beds I'd built along the fence, the raised planters where I grew tomatoes and peppers every summer. Someone had left a folding table out there from a recent gathering, and it was still sitting in the middle of the lawn, unfolded, one of the legs bent. I went back to the kitchen and started making dinner. Pasta, simple, what I had. Cassandra appeared in the doorway while the water was heating. We already ate. I kept stirring. "There's enough here if you want some." She hesitated in the doorway, the way she'd been doing lately, not quite present, not quite gone. There was something careful in her eyes when she looked at me now, a kind of measuring. It had started about 6 months after she and Derek moved in. They'd come to me 2 years ago with a story about financial difficulty. Derek's construction business had hit a rough patch, she said, just until they got back on their feet. I had a 4-bedroom house I'd owned outright since 2004, bought with money I'd saved over 20 years of work, and a modest inheritance from my mother. I said yes because she was my daughter, and because I believed the rough patch was temporary. Temporary had become permanent the way a guest becomes furniture. Derek's business hadn't recovered. He did occasional subcontracting work, cash jobs he didn't discuss in detail. Cassandra worked part-time as a dental receptionist. Neither of them paid rent. Neither of them paid rent because I had never asked for it. An error in judgment I had been cataloging for some time. After dinner, I went to my study to read. I'd converted the smallest bedroom into a workspace, bookshelves along 2 walls, my drafting table where I still drew furniture plans by hand, a lamp I'd built from a piece of reclaimed oak. My father's tools hung on a pegboard above the table. Chisels and planes and marking gauges, each one oiled and sharp. That room was the center of my life in this house. The door was open the way I always left it. I sat down, opened my book, got through 4 pages. I could hear Derek's voice from down the hall, louder than necessary, the way he always spoke on the phone. I heard the word equity. I heard the phrase not in his name alone. I stopped reading. I sat with the book open in my lap and listened. The call ended. Footsteps in the hall, passing my door without stopping. I set down the book and thought about what I'd heard. The next morning was a Saturday. I came downstairs early, before either of them was up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table. I pulled out my phone and opened the county assessor's website. My property. My name on the deed, no liens, no co-owners. I knew this, but I looked at it anyway. Then I opened my email and found 3 messages from a financial services company I didn't recognize. The subject lines referred to a home equity inquiry. My name and address. I had not initiated any home equity inquiry. My jaw tightened. I forwarded the emails to my own personal address, then deleted them from the shared family account I'd made the mistake of giving Cassandra access 2 years ago when she was managing some household bills. I changed the password. I said nothing at breakfast. Derek came down around 9, poured coffee without speaking, stood at the counter scrolling his phone. Cassandra followed 20 minutes later. We sat at the same table and said ordinary things about the weather and whether the market up the street had good peaches this year. I watched Derek's hands on his coffee mug. Strong hands, a working man's hands in the same way mine were, but he used them differently. He used them to take hold of things that weren't his. That afternoon I drove to the public library on Maple and sat at a research terminal for 3 hours. I had spent my working life building things from raw materials, reading grain and stress and joint tolerance. I understood structures. A man's financial history is a structure the same as any other. It has load-bearing points and weak joints and places where the material has been stressed past its tolerance. I started with Derek's business, Hartwell Construction LLC, registered in this state 4 years ago. I pulled the public filings. The business had been dissolved, not struggling. Dissolved 18 months ago. He hadn't told Cassandra. Or if he had, she hadn't told me. I printed the dissolution filing. Then I searched his name alongside financial records. A civil judgment from 3 years ago. A contractor dispute. $4,200. Small. Then another. Larger. A lender in a different county had filed suit over an unpaid business line of credit. The amount was listed as $68,000. The case was marked settled out of court, but the filing was public. I wrote the case number in my notebook. Then I typed his name alongside the words previous address and came across a newspaper archive from a smaller county 2 hours east of here. A community paper, the kind that publishes court proceedings. Derek Raymond Hartwell, listed in a bankruptcy filing from 6 years ago, Chapter 7. Prior to his relationship with my daughter, I sat back in my chair and looked at what was on the screen. My daughter had married a man whose financial history read like a map of other people's losses, and that man was currently attempting, from inside my house, to initiate an inquiry against my home equity without my knowledge or consent. I drove home the long way, let the evening air come through the window. Thought carefully. I was not a man given to reaction. I'd learned that early in the trade. A carpenter who reacts to a split grain by forcing the cut loses the piece. You stop, you assess, you find a different approach. Whatever you build has to last. I decided I would build something that lasted. Ray was at his workbench when I came by Sunday morning. He'd known me 30 years, longer than my marriage had lasted, longer than Cassandra had been old enough to make her own choices. He was the kind of friend who didn't require explanation before offering the spare room. I told him what I'd found. Not everything, not yet, but enough. He set down his plane and looked at me. You think she knows? I don't know what she knows. But I know what I heard on that phone call. Ray wiped his hands on a shop rag. How long do you need? As long as it takes to do this right. He nodded. Room's yours. I went home that afternoon and packed the things that mattered. My father's tools. I moved to Ray's garage myself. 3 careful trips, wrapped in moving blankets. The drafting table I couldn't move alone, but everything on it I took. The plans, the notebooks, the photographs, the deed to the house. My insurance documents. The will I'd updated 4 months ago with an attorney named Susan Greer, a woman I'd found through my accountant, quiet and precise, and not the type to lose paperwork. I packed a bag of clothes. I took the walnut cutting board. I left before Cassandra came home from her Saturday shift. I didn't leave a note. I left the key on the kitchen counter where they would see it and know I'd gone willingly. I wanted them to feel the relief. I wanted them to get comfortable. The thing about a house is that it teaches you patience. You wait for wood to dry before you joint it. You wait for glue to cure before you load the joint. You do not rush the process, because the process is the work. I sat in Ray's guest room that first night and thought about timelines. Derek's equity inquiry was the clearest thread. Someone had used my address and my name to initiate contact with a lender. If he'd gotten far enough to have a conversation, there might be documentation. I needed to find out how far he'd gotten. Monday morning, I called Susan Greer. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I valued about her. Then she asked 3 questions. Was my name the only name on the deed? Yes. Had I signed any documents in the past 6 months authorizing anyone to act on my behalf regarding the property? No. Did I have the email correspondence? Yes. Forwarded to myself, time-stamped. She was quiet for a moment. That's potentially fraud, she said. Inquiry without authorization. Do you want to pursue that now, or hold it? Hold it. I want to understand the full picture first. Smart. Come see me Thursday. Bring everything. I spent the week at Ray's table. He left a desk lamp on for me in the evenings, and didn't ask how things were going. That's the virtue of a man who works with his hands. He understands that some jobs require silence. I built my case the way I'd have built a piece of furniture. Start with what you know to be true. The deed, the dissolution of Derek's LLC, the bankruptcy, the civil judgments, the unauthorized equity inquiry. Then add what you can verify. I called the financial services company that had sent the emails, identified myself as the property owner, and asked what information had been submitted to initiate the inquiry. The representative was hesitant. I told her my name was on the deed, and I had not authorized the contact, and asked whether she would prefer I involve the State Consumer Protection Office before or after we had this conversation. She told me a preliminary inquiry had been submitted online using my name, address, and a partial Social Security number. No credit pull had been completed. The inquiry was flagged because the partial SSN didn't match the full record. He had tried and been stopped by a single incomplete digit. I thanked her and asked her to send me written confirmation of what she'd described, which she agreed to do. I printed it when it arrived and added it to the folder. Thursday with Susan Greer lasted 90 minutes. She read everything twice. When she looked up, her expression was the same as it had been on the phone, precise and unhurried. The equity inquiry alone might not be enough for a criminal charge, she said, but it's enough to document intent. Combined with the LLC dissolution he clearly concealed, and the financial history, you have a pattern. What do you want the outcome to be? I want my house back. I want them out. And I want him to understand that what he was attempting has been documented by more than one party. She nodded. Eviction is straightforward given you have sole ownership and no lease agreement. 30-day notice required under state law. I can file that this week. She paused. The fraud documentation I'd recommend holding until after they vacate. If they contest the eviction or things escalate, we use it. If they leave quietly, you still have it on record. File the notice. She filed it the same day. I drove to the house the following morning while Derek's truck was gone. Cassandra's car was there. I used my key, went inside. The house felt occupied in the way a space feels when someone else's habits have settled into it. Different smells, different objects on surfaces, unfamiliar coats on the rack by the door. They had rearranged the living room. My sofa was pushed against the far wall. A new coffee table sat in the center, glass-topped, the kind that shows every fingerprint. My reading chair had been moved to the corner near the window, pushed close to the wall, partially blocked by a fern in a pot, sidelined, even the furniture. I went through each room and photographed what had been changed. The kitchen, where 3 of my cabinet doors had been removed, apparently to create an open shelf look Cassandra had mentioned once in passing. The back bedroom, where someone had painted the wall behind the bed a deep charcoal without asking. The bathroom, where a vanity mirror I'd hung myself, was now replaced with one that was too large for the space, the old one presumably discarded. I photographed everything, quietly, methodically. Then I let myself out the side gate and drove back to Ray's. The certified eviction notice arrived at the house 2 days later. I knew because Cassandra called me within the hour. Dad, what is this? It's a legal notice to vacate. You have 30 days. She was quiet for a moment. Then her voice shifted into something I recognized from her teenage years. The tone she used when she thought the rules didn't apply to her. You can't do this to us. We live here, we've been here for 2 years, without a lease, without paying rent, in a house that belongs to me. That doesn't mean you can just throw us out. It does, actually. That's exactly what it means. Talk to a lawyer if you want to confirm it. She hung up. Derek called 40 minutes later. His voice was different from Cassandra's. Flatter, harder, more practiced. I think we need to have a real conversation, he said. I agree. Have it with my attorney. Her number is on the notice. He paused. You're making this into something it doesn't need to be. You made it into something the first time you submitted my name to a lender without my knowledge. Silence. Then, I don't know what you're talking about. Written confirmation from the lender disagrees. I have it in my files. The call ended. Ray brought sandwiches to the workshop that evening, and we ate without talking for a while. Outside, his neighbor's kids were playing in the street, the way kids do in summer when the days are long. I watched them through the window. You think she knew what he was doing? Ray asked finally. I turned it over. Cassandra was not a stupid woman. She had her mother's intelligence and her mother's tendency to look away from things she didn't want to see. Whether she knew the specifics or simply knew the direction he was heading and chose not to ask questions, I couldn't say. Either way, she had let it happen. Either way, the house I had built a life in over 40 years was at risk because my daughter had brought a man into it, and then stood aside while he tested its foundations. I don't know, I told Ray, but it doesn't change what I have to do. The next 2 weeks ran in 2 tracks simultaneously. One was visible, the other wasn't. The visible track was the eviction proceeding. Stuart and Cassandra, as I had expected, retained an attorney, a young man named Fielding, who sent Susan a letter arguing that 2 years of residence without a formal lease agreement constituted an implied tenancy and that the notice was insufficient and retaliatory following a minor family dispute. Susan read the letter to me over the phone in a tone that suggested she had encountered this argument before and found it unimpressive. The invisible track was a man named Thomas Whitfield. I had found Thomas the same way I had found the bankruptcy filing and the civil judgments, through the public record, through patience, through the habit of a man who spent his career understanding how things were put together. In Derek's bankruptcy filing from 6 years ago, listed among the creditors was a company called Ridgeline Custom Builds. The company was listed as owed $41,000. I had searched Ridgeline Custom Builds and found it was a small residential contractor still operating, owner listed in public filings as Thomas Whitfield, age 54, out of a county 2 hours east. I searched Thomas Whitfield alongside Derek Hartwell and found a court filing from the same period as the bankruptcy, a suit for fraud and breach of contract, filed by Whitfield personally, separate from the bankruptcy claim. The suit alleged that Derek had invoiced for materials never delivered, signed contracts for work never completed, and used Whitfield's equipment and supplier relationships to build jobs he then pocketed the payments for. The suit had been dismissed when Derek filed bankruptcy, the debt absorbed into the proceeding, but the dismissal was not the same as resolution, dismissed for procedural reasons. The underlying facts were never adjudicated. I wrote Thomas Whitfield a letter, handwritten, on paper, because some communications deserve that weight. I introduced myself. I explained my situation plainly. I told him that the man who had cost him $41,000 and several years of legal effort was currently living in my home and had attempted to submit my name fraudulently to a lender. I told him I had documentation. I told him I was not asking for money or involvement in anything illegal. I was simply extending the same courtesy I would have wanted someone to extend to me, the information that the man who had wronged him had not, as it appeared, changed direction. I included my phone number. He called 4 days later. His voice had the quality of a man who has spent time on job sites, straightforward, a little worn, no excess. He said he'd thought about Derek Hartwell more times than he could count over the years. Said the $41,000 was money he'd never fully recovered, that it had set his company back 3 years and his marriage back further than that. He asked me what I was planning to do. I told him about the eviction proceeding. I told him about the fraud documentation I was holding. I told him that I was working through the legal channels available to me and that I expected them to be sufficient. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's something you should know." He told me that before the bankruptcy, before the court case, he had heard from another contractor in the region that Derek had done the same thing to a residential client directly, not a business, a homeowner, an older woman in her 70s who had hired Derek to add a sunroom to her house. He'd taken a deposit of $12,000, done roughly $2,000 worth of framing, and then stopped work, stopped returning calls, and moved on. The woman had filed a complaint with the state contractor licensing board. Thomas didn't know the outcome. I thanked him. I told him I'd be in touch. I found the licensing board complaint the same afternoon. Filed 3 years ago by a woman named Ruth Ann Pelletier, 73 years old, the address listed in a township an hour south of here. The complaint described exactly what Thomas had outlined. $12,000 taken, work abandoned, Multiple attempts to contact the contractor ignored. The board's resolution was listed as license suspended for 60 days, fines assessed, fines partially paid, 60 days, for $12,000 taken from a 73-year-old woman. I sat with that for a while. Then I called Susan Greer again. She listened to the new information, the way she listened to everything, without interruption, with the focus of a person taking careful notes. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. The Pelletier complaint changes the character of what you have, she said. You now have a pattern across multiple victims, 2 businesses, and at least 1 individual homeowner, occurring over a period of years. The unauthorized equity inquiry in your case may be part of the same pattern. I'd recommend we contact the State Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Division. I want to time it correctly. She understood without needing elaboration. Wait until after the eviction hearing. Once they're out and the civil matter is resolved, file the criminal referral. That way there's no argument that it was filed to influence the eviction. Agreed. I also want to contact Ruth Ann Pelletier. Susan paused. Why? Because she deserves to know that her complaint wasn't the end of his story. And because when the time comes for the Attorney General's office to build a case, a corroborating witness from a separate incident will be useful. Susan's tone shifted slightly toward what I recognized as approval. I'll let you handle that personally. I found Ruth Ann Pelletier's phone number through a public directory. Called on a Tuesday evening. She answered on the 3rd ring, cautious, the way older people answer calls from numbers they don't recognize. I introduced myself, told her I was not selling anything, not affiliated with any company, and that I was calling because I believed we had a person in common and that the information might matter to her. She listened while I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, I knew he'd do it again. Her voice wasn't angry. It was something quieter and more certain than anger. The voice of a woman who had been right about something she wished she'd been wrong about. She told me she'd spent 6 months trying to get the board to do more than suspend his license, that her family had told her to move on, that the money was gone and the stress wasn't worth it, that she had moved on, mostly. But she had kept the files. I asked if she would be willing to speak with the Attorney General's office if the time came. She said, give me the number and I'll call them myself. Cassandra came to Ray's house 2 weeks into the process. She didn't call first. I heard the knock from the workshop, where I was helping Ray with a chair joint. She was standing on the porch when I opened the door. Thinner than I remembered, though it hadn't been that long. Something in her face had changed in the weeks since the notice arrived. The careful quality I'd noticed before was gone, replaced by something unguarded and tired. Can I come in? We sat at Ray's kitchen table. He found reasons to be in the workshop. She started to say several things and stopped. Then she said, Is there anything I can do to change your mind? I looked at my daughter. I had held her the day she was born. I had driven her to school for 12 years, and to college for 4, the last drive east on the interstate, with the car packed full of things she'd accumulated, both of us quiet because we knew it was a kind of ending. I had walked her down the aisle at a wedding I had misgivings about that I kept to myself because she was happy and because I believed in her judgment more than my own doubt. I said, Cassie, do you know what Derek tried to do with this house? She looked at the table. Her hands were flat against the wood the way hands go when a person is trying to stay steady. I know he made some inquiries, she said. Inquiries. He submitted my name and my address and a partial social security number to a lender without my consent. If that digit had matched, I would have had a second mortgage on my property before I knew what was happening. She was quiet. Did you know? I asked. She was quiet longer. Then, I knew he was looking into options. I didn't know he was using your information without telling you. I studied her face. I believed part of that. I wasn't certain which part. It doesn't change the legal situation, I said. The house is mine. The eviction notice is valid. The hearing is in 10 days. She looked up. Where are we supposed to go? That's a question I'd ask your husband. He's been in that house for 2 years without contributing to its costs. If he's been saving, you should be in reasonable shape. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He hasn't been saving. I thought about $68,000 owed to a lender. I thought about $41,000 owed to Thomas Whitfield. I thought about $12,000 taken from Ruth Ann Pelletier. He doesn't save, I said. He takes. There's a difference. She looked at me the way she hadn't in months, directly, without the measuring quality. I could see that she already knew what I meant. I could see that she had known it for some time and had been working very hard not to let herself finish the thought. Dad, I'm not going to tell you what to do about your marriage, but I need you to hear me clearly. What he was doing in that house was not a rough patch. He has a history that he didn't tell you about. I've been in the library. I know things about his finances and his prior business conduct that you need to know, I told her. Not everything, not all at once, but the shape of it. The dissolved LLC, the bankruptcy, the civil judgment, Thomas Whitfield, Ruth Ann Pelletier. She sat very still while I talked. When I finished, there was color in her face that wasn't quite embarrassment and wasn't quite anger. Something that was both and neither. He told me the LLC dissolved because of a bad contract, she said. He told me the bankruptcy was old and handled. I waited. She said quietly, I should have looked it up myself. Yes, you should have. But that's a lesson for later. Right now, we have a hearing in 10 days, and after that, a referral to the Attorney General's office that I intend to file, whether you're still with him or not. The hearing in 10 days, she repeated. Her voice had lost the thing it had when she arrived. The request to change my mind. I could see her recalculating, the way a person does when the ground shifts under them and they have to figure out where to put their weight. She left an hour later, without asking me to change my mind again. The eviction hearing was held in circuit court on a Thursday morning. I wore the same suit I wore to funerals and serious occasions. Susan met me outside the courtroom at 8:45, briefcase in hand, reading the opposing counsel's last filing on her phone as she walked. She did not look up when she said, We're going to be fine. Derek and Cassandra sat at the respondent's table with their attorney, the young man Fielding. Derek wore a jacket that was slightly too big in the shoulders. He didn't look at me when I came in. Cassandra did. I gave her a small nod. She looked away. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, Judge Helen Castor, who had the air of someone who had heard every variation of this argument and retained no patience for the ones that wasted time. Fielding argued the implied tenancy position, substantially the same as his letter. 2 years of residence, established domestic arrangements, no prior indication that occupancy was conditional. He argued the eviction was filed in direct response to a personal disagreement and constituted retaliation. Susan presented the ownership documentation, the chain of title, the absence of any lease written or recorded, the proper service of a 30-day notice according to state statute. She presented the photographic evidence of unauthorized structural modifications, including the removed cabinet doors and the unpermitted paintwork in a bedroom. She presented a brief statement from a building inspector confirming that 2 of the modifications would require permits that were never applied for. Judge Castor looked at the respondent's table. Did the respondents pay rent at any point during the 2-year occupancy? Fielding conferred briefly with his clients. No, Your Honor, but they maintained the property and contributed to household expenses. Judge Castor looked at the exhibits. She looked at Susan. She looked at me. Sole ownership is documented and undisputed. No lease was executed. No rent was paid. The plaintiff provided lawful notice under state statute. The respondents made alterations to the property without documented consent from the owner. The claimed implied tenancy does not survive the absence of any formal agreement and the owner's clear position as sole title holder. She ordered the eviction effective in 21 days. Fielding immediately filed a motion to extend the timeline on the grounds of hardship. Judge Castor allowed an additional 14 days, 35 days total. I could live with that. I called Thomas Whitfield from the courthouse parking lot. Told him the hearing outcome. He said, Good. Call me if there's anything else I can do. I told him the Attorney General's referral would be filed within the month. He said Ruth Ann Pelletier had already called his office independently and given a statement about her own case, that the investigator had confirmed there were other complaints in the system from other counties that the department had been collecting. There were others, I said. At least 2 that they'd connected, the investigator said. Possibly more. I sat with that for a moment. The mathematics of a man like Derek. The number of people whose losses funded the life he was building on top of mine. I drove back to Ray's and told him the hearing outcome over coffee. He said, When do you get your house back? 35 days. He poured more coffee. Then he said, What about Cassandra? I watched the light come through the workshop window and fall across the wood shavings on the floor. Ray keeps a clean shop, but there are always shavings. I don't know yet, I said. He nodded. He understood what I meant. Some joints you can repair. Some you have to cut away and start fresh with new material. You don't know which until you've cleaned the break. The 35 days passed the way waiting days do, slowly and then faster toward the end. Cassandra and Derek left 3 days before the deadline. I knew because Ray's neighbor, who lived 2 streets over from my house, mentioned seeing a moving truck. I thanked him and didn't drive past. I'd see it when I returned. A week after they left, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Cassandra. She'd gotten a new phone, she explained, which I understood to mean she had also gotten a new arrangement. The text said only, "We left it clean." "I'm sorry, Dad." I held the phone in my hand for a long time without answering. Then I typed back, "I know you are. When you're ready to talk, call me." She didn't call that week. I didn't expect her to. The day I returned to my house, I brought Ray with me, the same way I'd asked him to stay that first morning I'd planned my next move. Not because I needed help, but because some things are better witnessed. The house was clean. They had left it better than they'd found it in some ways. The dishes washed, the surfaces wiped, but the changes were still there. The missing cabinet doors, which they'd apparently taken with them, or discarded. The charcoal wall in the back bedroom. The imprint of different furniture on the carpet. The absence of 40 years of accumulated life reduced to the few things I'd taken to raise in advance. I stood in the doorway of what had been my study and looked at the bare walls where my pegboard had hung. Ray stood beside me. "It's still your house." "I know. That's the thing about a house. It waits." We started that day with cleaning, the deep kind, opened windows, let the air move through. I began measuring the study for the pegboard position. Ray held the tape. I reinstalled the pegboard that afternoon, hung my father's tools back in their places, the chisels and planes and marking gauges, each one where it had always been. The room smelled of oil and old wood. My room, my tools, my house. 3 weeks after I returned, Susan filed the referral to the State Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Division. The package included the equity inquiry documentation, the financial history I'd assembled, Thomas Whitfield's written account of his experience, and the licensing board complaint Ruth Ann Pelletier had filed 3 years earlier. It included a timeline I had built on drafting paper in my careful hand, 40 months of conduct, documented from public records and first-hand accounts. Susan told me the investigator had confirmed receipt, and that the file would be reviewed in combination with the existing complaints they'd collected from other counties. I asked what the likely timeline was. She said investigations like this took time, typically. Months, sometimes more. I told her I had patience. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already made peace with the fact that the outcome wasn't mine to control. I'd built the structure and placed it where it needed to go. What the law did with it from there was the law's work, not mine. What was mine was the house. I stood on my back porch 2 weeks into October, coffee in hand, looking at the garden beds I'd built along the fence. The tomatoes were finished, the plants pulled. I'd turned the soil and added compost, and covered the beds with straw for winter. In the spring, I'd plant again. The bent leg on the folding table, the one Derek's people had left in the middle of the lawn, I'd repaired it in the shop. The table was stored in the garage now, ready for the next time I needed it. Ray came over for dinner that Thursday the way he'd started doing once a week. I made the kind of meal that takes time. A braise, low heat, the patience of hours. We ate at the kitchen table under the light I'd rewired 6 years ago, the one that takes the warm bulbs I prefer. He asked about Cassandra. She had called the previous Sunday. A short call, careful on both sides. The conversation of two people testing weight before they put their foot down. She told me she had left Derek, that she was staying with a friend, that she had spoken with a lawyer about the financial situation, about what she was and wasn't liable for, about the debts in his name. She said she was trying to understand what the last 2 years had actually been. I told her she could take whatever time she needed. She said, "I should have listened to you." I said, "Maybe. But you needed to see it yourself." She was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, "I want to understand what he was doing with your house. I want to understand all of it." I told her I would tell her everything when she was ready to hear it. Not to punish her, not to prove a point, but because she deserved the whole picture of the man she'd trusted, and because understanding it was the only way to make certain it never happened again. We'd talk soon. Not yet, but soon. I told Ray this over dinner, and he listened the way he always did, without excess commentary. Then he said, "You're a patient man, Harlan. I thought about 40 years in finished carpentry, about the way you read grain before you cut. The way you wait for the right conditions before you join two pieces of wood, you want to hold together permanently. I'm a carpenter, I said. We learn to work with what the material gives us. He raised his glass. I raised mine. Outside, the October dark settled around the house I'd built my life in. The house that still had my name on the deed, that had waited for me while I worked, that stood exactly as I had left it, patient and solid and mine. I had not won cleanly. I had lost months of peace, a measure of trust I'd placed in my daughter, and a version of the future I'd imagined that included her and her husband in my life in a different way than this. But I had not been erased. I had not been quietly borrowed against and sold out from under myself. I had stood my ground and done it properly, document by document, step by step, in the way of a man who understands that the work worth doing is always slower than you want it to be, and stronger for that. Justice, I had come to understand, is not a moment. It's a structure you build carefully and leave standing long after the noise is over. If this story meant something to you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're listening from. To hear the next story, click on the video to the left. Thank you for watching.